Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. Hey, look, ever since from the first gun-power rockets from 13th century Song, China, through to the work of Robert Goddard in the 1920s, through to New Zealand's own Pickering, who headed up the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, we've come an immense long way over history. I don't want to sound ageist at all, but there's probably some members in this chamber who remembers the first Telstar, first TV satellite transmission in 1962. I know it's changed my life in terms of GPS, in terms of access to new content like Netflix. Everyone on this planet is influenced by space, and it's great to be in this Parliament discussing space legislation, particularly in light of New Zealand could be benefiting, we could be leading, we could be exporting technology around the world. I think it's a wonderful success story. Mr. Speaker, it's pretty amazing that, you know, as a species we've set foot on the moon, we've dropped probes onto Mars, we've sent our first probe out to Pluto with the New Horizons mission. We've even got spacecraft that have exited our solar system with the Voyager probes. We truly are a spacefaring species. And New Zealand, I guess, is now joining the ranks of those spacefaring nations. We heard it from the member David Shearer. There's only about a dozen nations that actually have orbital space capabilities. New Zealand is the only one who's doing it entirely privately on the backs of Rocket Lab, so it's an incredibly exciting story. It's an exciting time. We've got SpaceX doing their thing in the States along with Blue Origin. Just yesterday we saw a couple of taikonauts head up to the Tiangong Chinese space station, so it's an incredibly exciting time. It's great for New Zealand to be involved, and to be honest, it's built on the backs of a couple of inspiring, exciting New Zealanders, Peter Beck, Mark Rocket, and the amazing, innovative, exciting Rocket Labs. Everyone else is sharing their stories of their interactions, and I'd like to share mine. I was so proud telling people overseas about the story in New Zealanders, because so few people knew it, that right next to Auckland Airport is a warehouse where New Zealand is pioneering the nanosat, small to medium scale orbital rocket technology. It was incredible to walk around the facility and see the 3D printed rocket engines, which is part of their amazing advantages over some of the old sort of incumbent rocket launchers. It's incredible to see this happening right next to the Auckland Airport in little old New Zealand, to see the launches, and it's going to be fantastic to see that Electron rocket take off. They've noticed there's a gap in the market for nanosats and for more frequent, cheaper launches, and I wish them all the best. I think it's important not to forget that this is the only space thing happening in New Zealand. We have our role with the Square Kilometre Array. Southland and Invercargill, they're actually doing monitoring operations for the European Space Agency. So we have a history of space enterprise, and it's great to see that continue, but albeit at a much greater level. Now, I want to concentrate on the bill because it is incredibly important and quite technical and complex. So effectively what this legislation does is create a regulatory regime for the permitting and certification of launches, and including the payloads. The way the government's gone about it, I think on merit, is probably the most appropriate way. I think they've learnt the lessons what the Aussies did last century in the late 90s. It's more of a permissive regime because it acknowledges that technology is moving so fast that a more permissive regime is probably the wiser option. It gives the Minister the ability to tailor the conditions of the licence or permit to take account of the particular circumstances. It does put a lot of power into the Minister's hands, but the rationale, we think, is convincing. The legislation signs up to a number of international obligations, including the Technology Safeguards Agreement, the Convention on Registration of Objects launched into outer space from 1975. This, quite simply, allows the New Zealand government to meet its requirements to register objects that we're launching. And of course, under the Liability Convention ratified in 1974, the government effectively is responsible for what this private company is doing, so deals with a regime for liability, but also the insurance issues. Because as we know, rockets don't always go up the first time. Now, I'm quite staggered that Clause 76 hasn't been mentioned at all by members, because look, there are a few concerns the Green Party has with this legislation. We share the sentiments of members that we celebrate the work of Rocket Labs. We want to see them thrive. We want to see more advanced smart manufacturing and intellectual property. We want to see more space enterprises, but we do have concerns in the legislation. When you look at Clause 76, it deals with what happens if there is a launch failure. Clause 76 directly comes from Article 8, Subpart 3 of the Technological Safeguards Agreement, which basically was a requirement from the US government if we wanted to launch US payloads or access US technology. Now, I want to read it, Mr. Speaker, because I'm staggered that not a single member has raised this point in the debate so far. So, Clause 76, taking photographs, etc., of samples from debris recoverment area. A person commits an offence if any person in the debris area takes any photograph, makes any sketch, plan, model, note, or otherwise records any image or thing in the debris recovery area. This is quite staggeringly large in its scope. I note in the Bill of Rights Act vetting, the Attorney General looked at various clauses in the legislation, for example, Clause 77, which deals with interfering with a launch vehicle, where there is a breach of human rights, but the Attorney General said it was justified. Or you could look at the certificate where a launch can be stopped by the Minister by issuing a certificate based on national security concerns, but they can't go to court. It can't be judicially reviewed. Now, again, the Attorney General said it was justified, despite ostensibly breaching the Human Rights Bill of Rights Act in New Zealand. But this clause 76, wasn't mentioned at all. I find it staggering to consider that anyone could come across a bit of a downed rocket that accidentally failed, and it's impossible to sketch it, to take a photograph. Now, this comes, of course, from the US government, from the Technological Safeguards Agreement. So my questions are, what's the justification for it? Because it isn't mentioned at all in the regulatory impact assessment. In fact, it's noted in that document that it is a obligation of an absolute nature. Now, what's the reason? Is it to protect intellectual property? Is it to safeguard people? Is it a health and safety issue? Is it a non-proliferation issue? Now, we go into it with an open mind because perhaps there is a good justification for it. I note it's not the language or wording used in the TSA, so have officials simply been quite zealous to think of every potential possibility of how a person could interact with space debris? Could have they used interactive interpretive dance as something to include in Clause 76? So we'll be looking at that. You also see experts like Dr. Pozza raising questions why outer space as a term wasn't explicitly defined. Given this is the Outer Space Bill, it's possibly an important point, and that's something we look forward to working with the submitters, working with the experts, because ultimately what the Green Party wants to see is a good, robust, high-quality legislative act which gives a good regulatory regime to protect the environment, to protect health and safety, to protect the intellectual property, but we don't want to go overboard, perhaps with some Cold War mindsets in terms of not allowing people to sketch or model in terms of something that comes across their beach. As someone from the East Coast who grew up in Gisborne, Dad had a farm up in Whangarā, it's great to see Mahia benefiting. It's awesome to see that community benefit, and I hope they make the most of it. Now, Mr. Speaker, just to summarise, we think this is a good example of the smart, modern economy that New Zealand should be focusing on. There is a limit to the amount of tourists we can cram into Fiordland. There is a limit to the amount of cows we can cram onto our paddocks, and we're seeing those limits in our waterways. There's no limit to the smart ideas, the services, the intellectual property, the software that we could be exporting. This is the richer future for New Zealand, and I think this is a great exemplar. Best wishes to Rocket Lab, to Peter Beck and all his team. I think it's fascinating, exciting stuff what they're doing, but let's do our job in this House to make sure the legislation is as good as it can be and that we are asking those questions that result from Clause 76. Kia ora.
Mr. Speaker.